She begged for bread and was whipped for it. Her child cried until her voice gave out. The town turned away, except one man in the mountains. What he did next would shake every soul for miles. The lash cracked once, and no one flinched. Sarah Penrose didn't scream. Not because it didn't hurt, it did worse than fire, but because her daughter was watching. A small, rail-thin girl with red-rimmed eyes and bare feet, clutching a ragged doll as if it could shield her from the world. The townsfolk had gathered like vultures, standing outside the dry goods store on that hot July morning as if this were theater and she the entertainment. And at the center of it all, Sheriff Buckland stood like a statue carved from stone, arms crossed, eyes dull. No mercy there, no shame either. The second strike tore fabric and skin alike. Sarah's knees buckled, but she stayed up, just barely. Her hands were bound behind her, lashed to the post with thick rope. Her hair clung to her face, damp with sweat and blood. Her lips were cracked, but she said nothing. She just kept her gaze on her daughter Lottie. Sweet, hungry Lottie. 7 years old and already learning the world had no place for girls like her. "Maybe next time you'll ask with manners," the storekeep muttered, stepping back into his shop, wiping his hands like he'd just cleaned fish. Sarah had only asked for bread. 1 loaf. Just something to stop the trembling in Lottie's hands. She'd offered to scrub floors, haul water, even sweep out the outhouse. But the town was tired of beggars. Tired of the widow who'd come down from the ridge a month ago, looking like she'd crawled out of a grave, holding a child too light to stand on her own. The third lash came quick and final. Sheriff Buckland gave a grunt and nodded to the deputy, who cut the ropes with a flick of his knife. Sarah crumpled, one arm wrapped around her ribs, the other reaching blindly for the dirt. The crowd began to disperse, some muttering, others silent, but no one offered help. Except one. Lottie ran to her, dropping the doll in the dust. "Mama!" Her voice cracked, thin from thirst and too many nights crying herself hoarse. She tried to lift her mother's head, but Sarah winced too hard to let her. "Shh," Sarah whispered. "It's all right, baby, I'm here. But even her whisper trembled. They let her crawl to the edge of town. No one stopped her. No one cared. It was as if throwing her bones to the hills would erase their guilt, as if the whipping absolved them of responsibility. She wasn't a thief, hadn't stolen a crumb, but asking, begging, that had been enough. They reached the tree line just before dusk, Sarah dragging herself forward with what strength she had left. Lottie followed close, holding her mama's bloodied shawl in both hands. They'd come down the mountain weeks ago in search of food, kindness, anything to keep them alive after the winter sickness took Eli, Sarah's husband and Lottie's father. But the town had nothing to give. Or perhaps it did, but chose not to. A storm brewed in the distance, thunder murmuring like an old man behind the hills. Sarah spotted a shallow hollow beneath a fallen pine and gestured weakly. "There, we'll sleep there tonight. If the cold didn't take them, if the storm held off, if—" Lottie nodded and helped her crawl beneath the limbs. Then she gathered sticks and dry leaves like she'd seen her father do before. No fire. They had no matches. Just a blanket of needles and a little girl's willpower. That night Sarah thought she might die. Her back burned, her head spun, her body convulsed from cold and exhaustion. She tried to stay awake, tried to hum Lottie to sleep, but somewhere in the dark, sleep dragged her down like a river current. And somewhere deeper in the woods, a man opened his eyes. His name was Abram Coyle. He'd heard the cries. Not the lashes, not the town's cowardly justice, but the cry of a little girl echoing down the valley hours after sunset. It came soft, broken, like the wind itself had wept. Abram hadn't lived near people in years. He'd gone up the mountains after the war, after the things he'd done and seen turned his stomach. He didn't belong among folk anymore. But that cry, that tiny, wounded sound, it cut through his solitude like a blade. By morning, Abram was tracking footprints, small ones, lopsided, a woman dragging herself, a child walking beside her. No horse, no man, just survival stitched into the snow-melt mud and pine needles. He found them just before noon, both curled beneath the pine, barely visible beneath brush and needles. The woman looked dead, pale, lips blue. Her back had the look of rope and punishment. The child beside her stared back, not blinking. "She's sleeping," Lottie said softly, "I think." Abram crouched. "How long she been like this?" Lottie's shoulders lifted. "I don't know." "You got any food?" She shook her head. He looked at the woman again, thin as death, but her chest moved, faint but steady. The child needed food. The mother needed help. Abram swore softly under his breath, not in blasphemy but something else. A vow maybe. He hadn't touched another soul in years, not since the war, but he couldn't walk away. Wouldn't. He lifted Sarah into his arms. She didn't stir. "You trust me?" he asked the girl. Lottie looked up. "You're not gonna hurt us?" Abram met her eyes. "No, ma'am, I am not." She nodded once and picked up the doll from the pine needles. "Okay then." He led them back to his cabin, deep in the mountain's shadow, where no lawman ventured and no merchant hiked. It was built of thick logs, the roof patched in places, but it stood strong. A fire burned low in the hearth. The place smelled of pine tar and rabbit stew. Abram laid Sarah on his cot and covered her with wool. Then he handed Lottie a spoon and pointed to the kettle. "Eat, all of it." She obeyed, too hungry to be polite. Halfway through she paused. "She ain't gonna die, right?" Abram glanced at Sarah. "Not if I can help it." He boiled water, cleaned her wounds, crushed herbs from a box he'd kept locked since his mama's day. He worked with slow, sure hands. Not a doctor, but not a fool either. The child watched everything, eyes wide, silent as the trees outside. That night the storm came. Rain hammered the roof like hoofbeats. Sarah moaned in her sleep, sweating through the fever, jaw clenched tight. Lottie curled against her mother's side, too tired to cry. Abram sat by the fire, carving wood into thin, useless slivers. His way of thinking. He should have stayed out of it. But the sight of that child's ribs, the lashes on the mother's back, it lit something in him he thought had died long ago. Something fierce, something righteous. He didn't know what came next, but he knew one thing for sure. The town had whipped the wrong woman. And they were about to find out what it meant to shame the hungry and turn away a mother in need. Because Abram Coyle had buried better men than the likes of Sheriff Buckland. And tomorrow he'd dig something else up. The rain didn't stop till just before dawn, and when it did, the woods breathed in silence. Fat droplets slid from pine needles. Mist curled low around the trunks like ghosts dragging their feet. Inside the cabin, the fire had gone to embers, but Abram Coyle hadn't moved from the chair. He sat still, staring into the dying glow, his hands resting on his knees. The wood shavings from his carving lay like curled snowflakes at his boots. Behind him, the woman stirred. He turned just as Sarah gasped awake, eyes wild, breath sharp. She tried to sit but winced instantly, clutching her side. Lottie, still curled beside her, jerked up like a pup hearing thunder. "Mama," she whispered. Abram stood slow, not rushing. "Easy now," he said in that low, gravel-worn voice. "You're all right. You're in my cabin, mountain ridge above the hollow." Sarah blinked, still half lost in fever. Then her eyes locked on his face. "Where's the rope?" she croaked. He shook his head once. "Ain't no rope here. You were near gone when I found you. Girls said you'd been whipped. I saw it. I brought you up here." Her eyes flicked around the room, taking in the stone fireplace, the simple wooden shelves, the heavy beams above. There were no chains, no bars, just warmth, just quiet. Lottie pressed her forehead to her mother's cheek. "He saved us, Mama." Abram said nothing to that. Just went to the hearth and began stoking the coals back to life. Sarah's voice was a rasp. "Why?" He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, it was without turning around. "Some things a man sees he can't forget. I seen war. I seen cruelty. But I never seen a town whip a mother for begging bread. Not till yesterday." Sarah closed her eyes. Her lip trembled, but she wouldn't let it break. "Not yet." "I didn't steal," she whispered. "I know. And I begged polite." "You did." "And they said Lottie was a burden. Said I should leave her in the church steps and go west." Lottie's face tensed, but she didn't say anything, just gripped her mother tighter. Abram turned then, walking slow to a cupboard. He pulled a jar from the shelf, opened it, and scooped out dried berries and crushed oats. "You can stay here a few days, long as it takes to mend. Then you decide, head west, or stay a while longer." Sarah stared at him, not quite trusting, not quite refusing either. "What's it cost me?" His eyes met hers, steady and level. "Nothing. Some things don't come with price tags." A long silence stretched between them. Then Sarah looked at her daughter, at the girl's thin face and hollow cheeks. "Then we'll stay a little while." By the third day, Sarah could sit upright without wincing. By the fifth, she was able to walk. Not far, just to the porch, but the movement restored color to her face and let Lottie breathe easier. Abram kept to his ways. He didn't hover, didn't talk unless needed, but he chopped wood in front of them now, keeping one eye on the tree line, the other on the ridge below. Lottie followed him like a shadow. "What's that for?" she'd ask, pointing to the traps or the blades or the markings on the trees. Abram never shooed her away, just answered plain. "That one's for rabbits. That marks so I don't get turned around in the fog." Sarah watched the way Lottie's shoulders loosened, how the tremble in her hands faded by the hour. The mountains were hard but honest, and somehow that was safer than town had ever been. It wasn't until the seventh day that Sarah asked the question. "Why did you leave the world, Abram?" They were sitting on the porch. She brought out the wool blanket he'd loaned them and had it wrapped tight across her legs. Lottie was asleep inside, belly full for the first time in weeks. Abram didn't look at her when he answered. "Because I saw what it was becoming." "That was during the war." He nodded once. "Did things I ain't proud of, watched men burn homes, drag women from fields, justified it all by saying it was for the cause, but a cause that feeds on the helpless is no cause I'll follow, so I walked, and I never looked back." Sarah studied him for a long moment, and now. "I still don't look back, but sometimes the past walks up anyway." His jaw tensed then, subtle, but Sarah caught it. "Something's coming, isn't it?" Abram's eyes were fixed on the horizon. "I went to town yesterday," he said quietly. Sarah's heart stopped. "Why?" "To ask questions, find out who the lawman was, who let it happen." "And—" He turned toward her then, his face hard as carved stone. "They know you're gone, they don't know where, but the sheriff, Buckland, he didn't like my questions, he don't like folks digging. I reckon he'll send someone soon, not official, just a message." Sarah felt a tremor in her stomach. "You shouldn't have done that." He shrugged. "They already whipped you, what else they gonna take?" "My daughter," she said softly. "They said she was a mouth too many, said if I kept begging, they'd put her in the orphan rail." Abram's hands tightened into fists. He stood without a word and went inside. When he came back, he had a rifle in one hand and a saddlebag in the other. "I'll post up near the lower trail. If anyone comes, I'll see 'em before they see you." Sarah stood too fast and winced. "You can't fight a whole town, Abram." He met her eyes. "I ain't fightin' a town, just whoever thinks they can take a child from her mother." Then he was gone down the ridge, silent as dusk. Night came heavy. Sarah couldn't sleep. She sat by the fire, her back aching, her nerves tighter than wire. Lottie stirred now and then, whispering dreams, clutching the doll tighter with each passing hour. Around midnight she heard the crunch. Footsteps slow, measured, not Abram's. She rose, heart pounding, and moved to the window. At first she saw nothing, just mist and trees and the faint shimmer of moonlight on pine. Then a figure emerged. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a sheriff's star. Not Buckland, a younger man, maybe a deputy. He stood at the tree line, hand resting on his belt, looking toward the cabin like he owned the mountain. Sarah's breath hitched. She turned to grab the rifle, Abram's spare, but her fingers trembled. Then a second figure moved behind the first. "Abram!" He came from the shadows, rifle raised, quiet as a ghost. The deputy didn't even hear him. "I'd stop right there if I were you," Abram said, voice calm but sharp. The lawman spun, hand going to his holster. Too slow. Abram's rifle was already aimed square at his chest. "I come with a message," the deputy said, lifting both hands slow. "Sheriff says the woman's got 2 days to return, or he'll make it official." "Official like a hanging?" Abram asked, stepping closer. "No," the deputy said. "Official like the girl gets taken into care, and the woman gets tried for vagrancy. Might not be a rope, might be worse." Abram nodded once, then hit the man square across the jaw with the butt of the rifle. The deputy collapsed like a sack of stones. He didn't kill him, but he didn't need to. He left him in the snow and came back to the cabin, blood on his coat, but calm in his eyes. They sent a warning, he told Sarah. Now they got one back. What happens when they come again? She whispered. Abram looked at her, then at the girl. They won't come quiet, not next time. He stepped closer, voice low. We leave at dawn. I know a place north. Old fort, abandoned years back. Stone walls, spring-fed. If we're gone by sunup, they'll waste days tracking. Sarah hesitated. Everything in her ached. Everything screamed that this was too much. But then she looked at Lottie, at the scar on her own back. And she nodded. We go. They left before first light. Abram had packed what little he needed: flint, salt, dried meat, a hunting knife, and a compass that hadn't failed him since Tennessee. The rifle stayed strapped to his back. He slung the saddlebag across his chest and led the way, every step purposeful, steady. Behind him, Sarah clutched Lottie's hand tightly, the girl half asleep and swaying with exhaustion but never once asking to stop. Not once. The forest was a different creature before dawn. It whispered rather than roared. No birds yet, just the hush of wind through boughs and the faint creak of branches as they passed beneath. Abram had spent years learning the land, how to walk without waking the world, how to blend into silence. But now, every footfall from Sarah or Lottie made him twitch. Not because they were careless, but because danger didn't care about softness. He kept them off the main trails, skirting narrow ridgelines and rocky ravines where no horse could pass. The route was slow, brutal, uphill most of the way, but he needed that distance. He needed the town to lose their scent in the folds of the mountain. Sarah said little. Every breath was spent climbing, keeping up. Her back burned where the lashes had torn her open. Every jolt sent lightning through her spine, but she bit down hard and pushed forward. Not for herself, for the little hand in hers. Lottie never complained. By mid-morning they reached a shelf of rock overlooking a narrow pass. The view stretched for miles, miles of trees and fog and distant ridges like ribs pressing up from the earth. Below them, two riders moved through the mist. Black coats, guns at their hips. Abram motioned for them to drop flat. They did. He watched the riders through a narrow crack between stones, his breath shallow. They weren't searching hard, not yet. Just passing through, hoping perhaps to find a trace, a trail, a broken branch. But the horses slowed. One rider turned in the saddle, looked up, squinted. Sarah held her breath. The rider hesitated, then turned his mount and kept going. Abram didn't move until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the trees. That was too close, he muttered. Sarah nodded. She didn't trust her voice. Lottie was shaking, but she clung tight to her mother's side like a shadow that refused to be separated. They moved again, faster now. Abram's nerves were lit, eyes scanning every slope, every branch that bent wrong, every silence that came too sudden. He didn't know how much time they had, but it wasn't enough. The sheriff had made his move, and he wouldn't stop until he'd erased the shame Abram had handed him in the snow. By late afternoon, they reached the base of the old fort. It wasn't much, not anymore. Just stone walls half swallowed by moss, timbers that creaked in the wind, and a tower that leaned like a drunk on a Sunday morning. But the gate still stood, heavy iron bolted into rock. Inside, the courtyard was open to the sky but protected on all sides. A single well sat in the center, fed by a spring that hadn't dried in decades. Abram led them inside, then bolted the gate behind them. We'll rest here tonight, he said. Tomorrow I'll start laying traps. There's one way in and one way out. That's to our favor. Sarah looked around the crumbling walls. You sure this place'll hold? He met her eyes. It held off Apache raiders for a decade. It'll hold off cowards with 10 stars. She said nothing, but she nodded. Lottie dropped to the stone ground and curled up, too tired to speak. Sarah knelt beside her and covered her with her shawl. She glanced back at Abram. You've done more than I ever thought a man would. Abram just shook his head. I'm just setting things right. No, Sarah said softly. You're doing more than that. You're giving her a chance, me too. He didn't reply, just turned and began checking the perimeter. That night the stars came out cold and sharp. The fire they lit was small, hidden beneath a ring of stones in the farthest corner of the courtyard. Abram kept watch while Sarah and Lottie slept. He sat just beneath the edge of the tower, rifle across his lap, carving another sliver of wood in his hand. He carved a bird, then a star, then a name. Lottie. He scratched the letters into the back of the bird and set it aside. He'd leave it for her when they left, if they left. Because deep down, Abram knew something Sarah didn't. This wasn't over. The sheriff wouldn't rest. The deputy would return with stories of a wild man, of a woman harboring a child that didn't belong to the state. There'd be a bounty soon. Men without conscience would come next, hunters, not lawmen. The kind who tracked for gold and shed blood without remorse. And they would find this place, eventually. But morning brought more than light. It brought smoke. Abram saw it just after sunrise, 3 separate trails winding up the valley, 1 from the south, 2 from the east, campfires, scouting parties. They're closing in, he told Sarah. How long? Maybe a day, maybe 2. She looked down at Lottie, who was still asleep beside the cold fire. What do we do? I hold the gate. No, she said instantly, you can't fight them all. I can hold them long enough for you 2 to run. Through the north trail, I'll mark it. I'm not leaving you. You might not have a choice. They argued quietly, bitterly, until Lottie stirred. I heard you, the girl said sleepily. Sarah's breath caught. Baby. I'm not leaving either, Lottie said. Abram crouched beside her. Sometimes running is the best way to stay free. But it don't feel free, Lottie whispered. He smiled faintly. No, it don't. By midday, they were ready. Sarah had the knife Abram gave her, bone-handled, sharp. Lottie had a sling made of twine and smooth stones. Abram had his rifle, his traps, his years of watching death creep through forests like a rumor no one wanted to say out loud. The first man arrived at dusk. He came alone, walking with a swagger, a revolver low on his hip, a grin stitched across his face like he'd already spent the reward. He called out, voice loud, theatrical. Come out, widow, ain't no sense hiding, they just want the kid, you get to walk. Sarah tensed. Abram didn't reply, just watched from the shadows atop the tower. When the man stepped past the gate, something snapped. A trap. The iron jaws slammed shut on his leg, and he went down screaming. Sarah turned Lottie's face away, but the sound rang loud through the stones. Abram moved quick, rifle raised. Tell your friends, he called down, that this isn't a rescue, it's a reckoning. They come up this ridge, they don't leave. The wounded man sobbed something. Sarah couldn't hear. But then he scrambled backward, dragging the broken leg, leaving a trail of blood behind him. Abram didn't fire. Not yet. Let them be afraid first. But that night the woods were too quiet. No owls, no wolves, no wind. Sarah sat awake, Lottie curled against her. I used to pray, she whispered, before all this. Abram didn't answer. I stopped when Eli died. It felt like no one was listening. Still, he said nothing. But now, she looked up at the stars. I think maybe he was waiting for me to walk far enough to find the right person, someone who still remembered what kindness looked like. Abram stared into the fire, his jaw set. Kindness don't come natural to me. It doesn't have to. She reached out, touched his hand. It just has to come. The next morning, the sheriff arrived. And he didn't come alone. The sound of hooves echoed long before the riders appeared. Abram heard them first, a low thunder rolling through the mountain basin, not fast like a charge, but slow and certain like death taking its time. He climbed the tower again, eyes narrowed against the morning haze. The rifle stayed in his hands, loaded, ready. 6 riders, maybe 7, too far to count clearly through the trees, but enough to mean business. The sheriff led them. He rode tall, his duster flapping like a preacher's robe, the tin star pinned to his chest glinting in the sun. But what struck Abram most wasn't the number, it was the calm. These weren't panicked men. They weren't guessing. They were sure. They believed this ridge belonged to them already. They're common, Abram called down. Sarah looked up from the well where she'd been washing Lottie's face. How many? More than I can drop in one volley. She nodded once, wiping her hands dry on her skirt. Her back still ached, raw and tight, but she didn't wince. Not anymore. Lottie peeked out from the old wooden shed that had become her hiding spot. Her hair was tied back now, her cheeks fuller from days of food and rest, but her eyes held no illusions. She had seen the world's teeth, and they'd left a mark. Abram climbed down slow, calm. His boot struck the stone like a clock counting down. "They won't ride in fast," he said, setting the rifle on the table. "Not after the trap yesterday, but they'll come." Sarah stood still a moment, then reached under her skirt and pulled the knife from its sheath. "So will we." Abram allowed himself a small glance of respect. No smile, just a nod. He walked to the gate and unbolted it halfway, enough to draw them close but not enough to surrender the high ground. Then he scattered more traps beneath the brambles outside. Deadly ones, triggers hidden beneath dry leaves and brush, the kind that took a foot or a leg depending on the weight. By mid-morning, they saw the riders clear as day. Sheriff Buckland reined in at the edge of the old fort's clearing. He sat tall, spine straight like a man trying to prove something. His face was leaner than Abram remembered, his mustache grown out, eyes sunk deep in tired skin, but the smugness had grown, not shrunk. "You've made this hard, Coyle," he called, his voice carrying across the stones. "Didn't have to go like this." Abram leaned against the gate frame, arms crossed. "Didn't have to whip a woman for asking for bread, either." Buckland spat in the dirt. "Town's got rules, she broke 'em. She survived, that's all she did. You punished her for not dying quiet." A low murmur rippled among the men behind Buckland. One of them shifted in his saddle. Another looked away. Buckland raised his voice. "That woman's got a warrant now, official, signed and sealed, harboring a child under false name, theft of township goods, interference with law." Sarah stepped into view then, her shoulders square. "The bread was never handed to me, and my name's my own." Buckland's eyes snapped to her. "You should have run when I let you go. I gave you that chance." "You gave me lashes," she said evenly. "I gave you grace by not leaving you broken in the mud." He laughed. "Big talk, widow, hiding behind a mountain ghost." Abram picked up his rifle. "Try me," he said. A beat of silence. Then Buckland's smile dropped. He turned to one of his men and whispered something. The rider peeled off, circling left. Another followed. They were flanking now, testing the lines. Abram noticed. He turned to Sarah. "Inside now, keep her close." She didn't argue. He climbed the tower again. This time he aimed. The first shot cracked through the mountain air like a thunderclap. One of the riders went down, horse bucking, man tumbling into the brush with a scream. Buckland ducked. "Coyle," he roared, "you want to make this a war." "Already is," Abram muttered, reloading. Another rider charged the gate from the right. Abram waited, timed it, and fired again. The man's shoulder jerked back and he toppled from the saddle, rolling once before going still. Now the real shooting started. Bullets pinged off stone. Wood splintered. The walls held mostly. Sarah kept Lottie behind the shed, her body shielding the girl. Dust rose, smoke thickened. Abram kept firing. Calm, clean, like chopping firewood. He didn't shoot to kill unless he had to, but he wasn't afraid to end it either. After 15 minutes, the guns stopped. Not for surrender. For regrouping. Abram climbed down, face pale with sweat. "They're pulling back." Sarah peered around the shed. "Why?" He pointed to the riderless horses. "Lost 3, maybe more wounded. They'll want another plan." "What's our plan?" Abram wiped his brow with his sleeve. "We hold." She looked at him, her voice low. "And if we can't?" He looked back at Lottie. "Then she runs, you both do. North Trail, I'll give you time." "I won't leave you." He stepped close, eyes hard. "This ain't about me." "It is now," she whispered. But she didn't argue further. Night fell like a hammer. They buried the fire deep, cooking in a small tin pot with a scrap of rabbit and foraged roots. Sarah made Lottie eat first, watching every bite like it might be her last. Abram sat near the gate, staring into the dark, rifle across his lap, fingers twitching. Around midnight, a voice called from the trees. It was Buckland. It was a woman. "Sarah?" the voice asked, soft, uncertain. "Sarah Penrose." Sarah stiffened, rose to her feet. "Who's that?" The voice stepped closer. A girl no older than 20, dirt-smudged hair in braids. My name's Clara. I saw what they did to you. I was there. Sarah didn't speak. I brought something. The girl held up a cloth bundle. Abram was already at the gate, gun ready. Why? Clara's eyes were wide, honest, scared. Because I begged once too, before my pa died. I didn't know what to do, but when you got whipped I saw myself. Sarah walked slowly toward the gate, not too close. What's in the bundle? Bread, dried meat, some medicine. Sarah looked back at Abram. He nodded once. She opened the gate just wide enough and took the bundle. Thank you, she whispered. Clara hesitated. There are others, in town, not many, but they talk. They say Buckland's gone too far. Then tell them this, Sarah said, stepping closer. He's not the law anymore, he's the sickness, and we've had enough sickness. Clara nodded. Be careful, he's planning something. More men tomorrow maybe. Then she disappeared into the trees. The next morning came thick with fog. Abram barely slept. Sarah didn't sleep at all. Lottie curled in her lap, her doll hugged tight. Her eyes stayed open though, watching. Waiting. They all knew what was coming. The final push. The fog hadn't lifted by morning. It lay thick across the mountain like a wool blanket soaked in cold, clinging to stone and tree alike, muting every sound into a whisper. Abram Coyle stood motionless atop the tower, eyes narrowed, fingers wrapped tight around the barrel of his rifle. He hated fog. Fog was cover for men who didn't deserve to breathe the same air as children. Fog was the trickster's friend, the liar's mask. Down below, Sarah sat in the shed with Lottie pressed close. The child had eaten quietly, no words, just a chew and swallow rhythm like a soldier in a trench. Sarah had braided her daughter's hair that morning, not because it mattered, but because it made her feel like she still had a say in something. Every tug of the braid was a reminder that Lottie was real, still here, still hers. Abram finally climbed down, boots heavy on the stones, and shook his head. Can't see past the ridge. Sarah stood. They'll come through it. They'll try. He knelt beside a crate, opened it, and removed a half-dozen small jars, each filled with a black powder mixture, each capped with wax and cloth. Homemade flashbangs, crude but blinding. He lit one and lobbed it toward a boulder. When it hit, it burst with a thunderclap and cloud of white smoke. Lottie flinched. Sarah gasped, but Abram just nodded. That'll give us seconds if they breach. You made that? Sarah asked. Learned in the war. Noise was our best friend in the dark. He handed her one. You throw if they get too close. Shut your eyes first. She took it, gripping it like it might burn. He glanced at the sky. No birds, that ain't good. Sarah followed his gaze. Nothing, not a single wing overhead, not even a crow. The woods were holding their breath. Then came the horn. Low, hollow, distant. They're starting, Abram muttered, moving fast. Stay here, guard the girl. Don't open the gate for anything, not even me. Sarah nodded. Don't die. He paused just long enough to meet her eyes, not planning on it. Then he vanished into the fog. They came in waves. The first was silent, no shouting, no bravado, just shapes moving between trees, dark coats, long guns, hired men, not deputies, bounty hunters. Abram was ready. The first two triggered his traps before they reached the wall, one with a snapping wire that tore through his ankle, the other with a stake that drove into the soft of his thigh. Their screams alerted the rest, who pulled back just long enough to rethink. That gave Abram the high ground. He fired from the tower, ducking between stones, reloading with speed that came from years of practice. The fog was a curse, but it worked both ways. He saw only shadows, but so did they. Sarah, meanwhile, crouched behind the gate with her blade in the flash jar. Lottie sat with her back to the well, holding the doll like a shield, whispering something over and over. Sarah crept to her. What are you saying? Lottie looked up. I'm praying. Sarah felt something break inside her. A month ago, the girl had sworn off prayer, said it didn't work, said no one was listening. But now, in the middle of fire and fog, she whispered to heaven again. And somehow that gave Sarah breath. Abram counted 6 shadows weaving through the brush. They were coming from all angles now, crawling low, using the boulders and stumps as cover. He dropped two more, center mass, before his rifle clicked dry. He ducked back, hands moving quick to reload. Then he heard the creak. The side gate. Someone had found it. He moved fast down the inner ladder through the courtyard, toward the narrow wooden slat that ran behind the shed. It had rotted mostly, but was still hinged. He'd reinforced it 2 nights ago, just in case. A man burst through before Abram could reach it. Big, wild-eyed, beard down to his chest. He held a double-barrel shotgun in the face of a man who'd seen too much whiskey and not enough daylight. He shouted something, didn't matter what, and raised his weapon. Sarah was already there. She stepped from behind the shed and threw the jar. It hit the man square in the chest. The flash blinded everything. White light, smoke, a roar like thunder cracking open the earth. The man screamed, dropped the gun, stumbled back into the wall. Abram lunged, tackled him, drove a fist into his jaw, then again, then once more for good measure. He left the man unconscious in the dirt and turned to Sarah. Good throw. She panted, still clutching the knife. I was aiming for his head. Outside, the fog began to lift. The sun hadn't burned it off, but it had thinned it, just enough to show the men what they were walking into. Bodies on the ground. Blood in the soil. A mother with fire in her hands. A man who wouldn't die easy. Buckland stood at the tree line, watching. He didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He raised one hand. More men came. Not hired guns this time, not bounty hunters. These were townsfolk, reluctant, pale, some young, some old. None of them looked like they wanted to be there, but they held rifles. And they advanced. Abram saw it from the tower. He's conscripted the town. Sarah frowned. They followed him. Maybe they were told lies. Doesn't matter now. They're here. Then we tell them the truth. He looked down at her. You think that'll stop bullets? No, but maybe it'll stop their hands. Abram didn't argue, but he didn't agree either. He climbed down. Together they walked to the gate. He opened it and stepped out. Unarmed. Sarah followed, hands at her sides, face calm, even though her heart beat like a drum. The townsfolk paused. Buckland snarled, "What is this?" Sarah called out, "I was whipped for asking for bread, not stealing it, not cheating, asking." Murmurs. One man lowered his rifle a little. "I bled in your streets," she said, louder now, "and you turned your eyes. I carried my daughter back into the hills while you all went back to your supper, and now you want to call me a thief, a criminal." Buckland shouted, "You broke law." "No," Abram said, stepping forward. "She broke silence. That's worse to men like you." Buckland pulled his gun. "Ain't nobody asked you, mountain rat." Abram didn't blink. "You don't get to write the law just because you wear a badge. That's not justice. That's cowardice." The crowd shifted. A few more rifles lowered. One woman whispered, "He's right." Buckland turned, red-faced. "Anyone lowers their gun again, they'll answer to me." He raised his pistol at Sarah. That's when Lottie stepped from behind the wall. She walked into view, tiny barefoot, face streaked with soot and tears. She looked straight at Buckland. "You hit my mama," she said, "and you're scared of her now. That's why you brought all these people." The silence was a coffin lid. Buckland's hand trembled. "You shut your mouth, girl," he muttered. But no one backed him. Not one. Abram stepped between Buckland and the child. "You got 5 seconds to drop that gun." Buckland looked around. He saw the crowd. Saw the rifles lowered. Saw the eyes that once followed, now questioning. His pistol lowered, then raised again. Abram didn't hesitate. One shot. Clean. Right in the shoulder. Buckland spun and dropped, howling in the dirt, the pistol spinning from his hand. Abram stood over him, breathing heavy. "This is over." Buckland clutched his arm, face twisted in rage and pain. "You shot me." Abram knelt beside him. "Next time I won't miss." The townsfolk helped carry the wounded down the ridge. They said nothing. They didn't apologize. But they didn't follow anymore, either. Sarah, Lottie, and Abram stood at the edge of the fort wall, watching them vanish into the trees. Lottie looked up. Are they gone? For now, Abram said. Sarah didn't speak. She just wrapped her arms around her daughter and held her close. For the first time, the wind didn't feel cruel. For the first time, the ridge felt like home. The ridge fell silent again. Not the silence of fear or dread or hiding, but something deeper, earned, settled, like the mountain had taken a long breath and let it out, the kind of stillness that came only after the worst had passed. Abram didn't say much that evening. He sat by the courtyard well, washing blood from his hands with a tin cup and a rag. He'd grazed Buckland, not killed him. He could have ended it with a bullet to the heart, but he hadn't. That mattered. Maybe not to the law, maybe not to Buckland, but to himself. He wasn't that kind of man anymore. Sarah came to him just as the sun sank low behind the pines, painting the broken stone walls gold. Her sleeves were rolled to her elbows, and her hands still trembled from the weight of everything, but she stood taller than she had a week ago. Stronger. He'll be back, she said quietly. Abram didn't look up. I know. He'll come with papers, real ones. State seal, judge's hand, might even come with real lawmen. Abram wrung the rag once, then tossed it into the basin beside him. Then we don't wait. Sarah raised an eyebrow. You mean run again? No, he stood, wiping his palms against his coat. I mean we take this to them. Her expression flickered confusion, then worry. We go to town. We go past it, Capitol's 3 days down the West Trail. I know a marshal there. Honest one. Name's Anders. Owes me a favor from way back. You think he'll help us? Abram nodded. If he sees what Buckland's done, if you tell him, if Lottie tells him. Sarah hesitated. I've never been further than Bitter Hollow. I don't know what's out there. He met her eyes steady and firm. Then it's time to find out. The decision was made by dawn. They packed light, just what they could carry in one satchel each, blankets, smoked meat, a tin of beans, dried apples. Abram gave Lottie his compass and showed her how to read it. She beamed like he'd handed her gold. You watch the needle, he told her. It don't lie. Sarah helped wrap her daughter's feet in extra cloth, tying strips of old coat around her ankles for makeshift boots. It wasn't perfect, but it'd do. She'd stitched a thin scarf from one of Abram's old shirts to keep Lottie's ears warm in the mountain wind. By mid-morning, they set off westward, following the trail that hadn't seen a wagon in over a decade. It wound through pine and shale, hugging cliffs and slipping beneath canopies so thick the light barely pierced through. It was not a trail for the weak. But they were not weak anymore. Each step they took was a refusal, to go back, to bow, to break. Sarah walked in front with Lottie close behind. Abram brought up the rear, his rifle slung and eyes scanning every ridge, every shadow. He'd spent years walking this land alone. Now every crack of branch felt louder, every silence deeper, because he wasn't just walking for himself anymore. He was carrying their safety in his hands. That night they camped beneath a rock outcrop. A small fire, low and smokeless. Abram showed Lottie how to catch a squirrel with snare wire, how to skin it without waste. She watched with wide eyes but steady hands. You teach her everything? Sarah asked after Lottie had curled up in the blankets. If I can, he said. Out here, knowing something's better than hoping someone else does. Sarah nodded. I was taught how to sew and curtsy. Not much good that did me when the hunger came. Abram poked the fire with a stick. Curtsying don't scare wolves. No, she murmured, but it sure pleases men like Buckland. They sat in silence for a while. Then Sarah said, Why'd you really come back to town, Abram? He looked at her surprised. What do you mean? That day when you found us, you said you heard Lottie crying, but why'd you come down the ridge at all? Why that day? Abram leaned back against the stone, eyes rising to the dark canopy above. Because I'd had a dream, he said finally. Sarah frowned. A dream? Yeah, first one in years. I don't usually dream. But that night I saw a woman standing in snow, shawl soaked through, her back bloodied, a child clinging to her, begging the wind to stop. Sarah's breath caught. I woke up shaking, he went on. sweating like I'd run 10 miles, couldn't shake the feeling that someone was calling me. She whispered, "So you followed a dream." He looked at her. "I followed God." The fire popped, sending a burst of sparks skyward. Neither spoke again that night. The next day they crossed an old bridge, just two logs laid across a gorge, slick with moss and ice. Abram went first, then Lottie, then Sarah. The wind howled through the gap, but they made it across without incident. The forest thinned on the third day. Pine gave way to rolling hills and fields left fallow. The capital was still hours off, but they could smell it now: coal smoke, horses, sweat, civilization. Abram grew tense. Sarah noticed. "You sure this marshal can be trusted?" "I wouldn't be bringing you if I was." They reached town just before sundown. The capital wasn't grand, just a cluster of brick buildings, a courthouse, a few saloons, and a rail depot, but it was bigger than Bitter Hollow by miles, and it had law. Real law. Abram led them straight to a tall building with ironwork windows and a star etched above the door. Marshal Anders was inside. He was older now, white in the beard, thicker around the middle, but his eyes still had the same sharpness, the same cut-glass focus. He looked up from his desk and stared at Abram like he'd seen a ghost. He said, standing. "Abram Coyle, I thought you were long dead." "Not yet," Abram said. Anders looked at Sarah and Lottie, and them. "Victims," Abram said, "of a sheriff who forgot what law is." The story took an hour to tell. Sarah spoke slowly, clearly. Her voice shook at times, but she never faltered. Lottie added what she remembered, her voice small but certain. Anders didn't interrupt. When they finished, he leaned back in his chair, eyes unreadable. "You got anything to back this?" "Wounds," Abram said. "Witnesses, maybe. Girl from town named Clara. She brought food after the first attack." Anders sighed. "And Buckland. Still wears the star, still sends men to kill for him." Anders rubbed his jaw. "I knew him once. Greenhorn deputy, hot-headed, didn't have much patience for rules." "Now he's got power," Sarah said, "and no one checks him." Anders stood, walked to the cabinet, pulled a thick leather folder and began writing. "I'll sign a warrant," he said. "Official, federal. I'll ride with you if I have to." Abram nodded. "Good." Anders glanced at Lottie. "You're brave, little one." She didn't smile, just held her mother's hand tighter. They spent that night in the marshal's back quarters. Real beds, real roof, no wind through cracks. Sarah wept quietly into her pillow while Lottie slept, not from fear, not from grief, but from the sheer weight of safety pressing down on her. It felt foreign, heavy, like she didn't deserve it. Abram sat outside, watching the sky. Anders joined him near midnight, flask in hand. "You've changed," Anders said. "Time does that. You used to have fire, now you've got stone." Abram didn't answer. Anders offered the flask. Abram refused. "You still praying?" Anders asked. Abram nodded, "More now than ever." Anders smiled. "Good, you'll need it because this ain't over." Abram looked at him. "I know." Back in Bitter Hollow, Buckland sat in his office nursing a sling and a bottle. When the telegram came, he read it twice. Then he stood face pale and drew his gun. "Looks like they brought the law." He spat into the fire. "Let's see if law bleeds." They rode back with the storm at their backs. Marshal Anders didn't wait for ceremony. The moment he'd stamped the warrant and gathered his gear, he mounted up with Abram at his side, Sarah and Lottie close behind in the borrowed wagon Anders kept for travel. The seal of the United States government gleamed on the leather folder tucked beneath Anders' arm. It wasn't just ink and paper, it was power. Real power. The kind men like Buckland forgot existed when they made themselves gods in small towns. They left the capital at first light, the wagon wheels rattling over frozen ruts, horses snorting against the wind. Abram kept his rifle across his knees, eyes always scanning. He didn't trust clean roads or open fields. Too many places for men to wait, too much pride in the kind of men who'd rather kill than admit defeat. Sarah sat beside him on the bench seat, her hands gloved, jaw set. She hadn't spoken much since the hearing. Something about the way Marshal Anders had looked at her, like she was a witness, not a victim, had stirred something in her chest. She wasn't used to being believed. She didn't quite know what to do with it. Lottie, in the back beneath a thick wool blanket, hummed softly to herself as she played with the wooden bird Abram had carved. Her cheeks were flushed pink from the cold, but her eyes were alert, watchful. She hadn't once asked if they were safe. That question didn't live in her anymore. It had been burned out the same day her mother was whipped in front of the dry goods store. By the second day, the sky grew darker. The clouds rolled in thick and fast, dragging the wind with them like a broom sweeping dirt through the trees. Anders kept checking the sky. "We'll make it to Hollow by dusk," he said, "if the storm holds." Abram said nothing. He knew the storm wouldn't hold. And he knew Buckland wouldn't either. But in Bitter Hollow, Sheriff Buckland had already begun preparing his defense. He wasn't a fool, not the kind that believed he could outdraw a federal marshal, but he was the other kind. The kind who'd built a life on fear, who understood how to infect others with it. He'd gathered 6 men in his office by the time the snow started falling, each one hand-picked for their silence, their desperation, or their anger. "They're coming," he said, pacing behind his desk. "Not just the mountain man and the widow. They got the law with them, big city badge, Anders, you remember him." The men exchanged glances. One spit into the fire. "So what do we do?" the oldest asked. Buckland slammed his palm against the desk. "We remind him whose town this is." "And if Anders don't care?" another asked. Buckland leaned in, eyes narrowed. "Then we make sure they don't reach the courthouse." The snow began mid-afternoon, flurries at first, then thicker, heavier. The wagon slowed as the trail narrowed into rocky switchbacks that hadn't been cleared since autumn. Sarah gripped the seat's edge, watching each wheel shudder and jerk as the ruts grew deeper. "Should have waited," Anders muttered. "Another day, let it pass." Abram shook his head. "He'd have run or worse." Lottie tugged at the tarp in the back. "Mama," she whispered, "I think someone's behind us." Sarah turned. Sure enough, faint through the trees, a flicker of movement. Abram squinted, too fast for animals. Anders drew his revolver. "How many?" "2 maybe," Abram said. "Scouts." They pulled the wagon off the road into a thicket of pine. Abram jumped down, rifle ready. Anders moved to the opposite side, taking cover behind a boulder. Sarah climbed into the back and pulled Lottie close. Then came the first shot. It missed, striking the tree near Abram's head, sending bark flying. He dropped to a knee, aimed, and fired. A cry echoed through the trees. A man hit. Another figure darted left, but Anders was faster. His revolver barked once, and the second rider tumbled from the saddle, sliding into the snow. Abram stood. They were sent. Anders nodded grimly. Buckland scared. "He should be." They reached Bitter Hollow at dusk. Snow blanketed the rooftops. Smoke curled from chimneys, but the streets were empty. Too empty. Abram, Sarah, and Lottie crested the final rise just before noon. The trail behind them had been quiet, empty of riders, smoke, or fear. They'd taken the long way back, through lesser trails and narrow canyons, far from the eyes of town folk and bounty hunters, far from memories that cut deep. And now, as they stepped once more into the overgrown clearing of the old fort, it was like slipping into the arms of something familiar. Home. It wasn't much to look at. The same crumbling walls, the leaning tower, the moss-covered stones. But the gate still stood. The spring-fed well still gurgled quietly in the center of the courtyard. And the silence that wrapped around the place didn't carry the weight of dread anymore. It carried peace. Abram set down his pack by the tower wall and turned slowly, taking in the grounds. He could see where their old campfire had burned, where Lottie had once sat cross-legged playing with a stick, where Sarah had washed the blood from her hands after a fight no mother should have had to face. But it was different now. The air felt lighter, the shadows less sharp. Sarah stepped up beside him, her skirt brushing the tops of wild grass already poking through the snow. Her cheeks were pink from the hike, but her eyes were steady. "Still here," she said softly. He nodded. "Told you it'd hold." She looked over at Lottie, who had already scrambled up onto a stone slab and was standing like a queen surveying her kingdom. "She's different," Sarah said, Since the trial. Not afraid anymore. No, not afraid, but not soft either, like something grew in her that wasn't there before. Abram glanced at the girl, strength like her mother. Sarah didn't respond, but her fingers brushed his just for a second and then withdrew. They spent the rest of the day cleaning. It wasn't a plan, just instinct. Sarah began sweeping out the small shed where they'd once taken shelter. Abram fetched fresh water from the well and checked the trap lines he'd left weeks ago. Most were broken or rotted, but a few could be salvaged. Lottie helped gather dry kindling, stacking it with careful hands beside the hearth pit. They didn't talk about what came next. They didn't need to. That night, as they sat around the fire, the stars blazed clear above the open courtyard. Lottie curled between them, her head resting on her mother's leg, one hand clutching the wooden bird Abram had carved for her. Sarah stirred the pot hanging over the fire. Rabbit stew, thin but hot. She ladled some into each tin cup and passed them around. No one said grace aloud, but Abram bowed his head for a moment before lifting his spoon. Lottie slurped a mouthful, then asked, "Can we stay here forever?" Sarah smiled, brushing a hand over the girl's hair. "As long as it's safe." Abram looked into the fire. Safe ain't always a place. Sometimes it's a choice. Sometimes it's a person. Sarah met his gaze. The firelight danced in her eyes. And sometimes it's both. He nodded once, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Worn, smudged, creased so many times the ink had started to fade. He handed it to Sarah. She opened it. A deed. Signed by Anders, notarized, witnessed. Land title, Abram said. Marshall said the fort was unclaimed federal property, been abandoned too long, now it's yours. Sarah's breath caught, mine. He nodded, yours and hers, you plant here, you build. You raise chickens, goats, whatever you want. No one can take it now, not Buckland, not the town, not anyone. Lottie sat up. Mama, does that mean we're real settlers now? Sarah laughed, light, clean, a sound that hadn't lived in her throat for months. Yes, baby, I think it does. She looked at Abram. What about you? I'll be around. You're not leaving. He stared at the fire. I left the world because it was too loud, too cruel, but you too, you make it quieter. Sarah reached out and placed her hand over his. I don't need quiet, she whispered. I need someone who won't run. He turned his palm upward, wrapped his fingers around hers. I'm done running. The days passed slowly after that. And peacefully. They built a second shelter beside the tower, just big enough for three, with stone walls Abram rebuilt from the crumbled edges of the old barracks. Sarah cleaned the old hearth and used it for cooking, just like she had in town. She even laughed once, saying it reminded her of her mother's kitchen before sickness took her. Lottie made friends with the crows. She began naming them, feeding them scraps, talking to them like old neighbors. Abram didn't interfere. Let her talk to whatever god or bird or tree kept her spirit calm. Sometimes travelers passed the ridge, trappers, old gold hunters, a few lost riders, but none stayed, and none threatened. News came slow. Weeks later, a courier from Anders brought a letter sealed with the state stamp. Sheriff Buckland had been found guilty. Sentenced to 10 years hard labor. His deputies were dismissed. A new sheriff appointed, one chosen by the town this time. Clara wrote too. Her letter was short but sweet. They listen now, she said. Not all, but enough. Sarah cried when she read it. Not loud, not broken, just soft tears that fell and stained the page as she clutched it to her chest. They listen now. It was enough. One afternoon, a storm rolled in quick, wind shrieking through the trees, clouds roiling black like coal smoke. Abram and Sarah rushed to cover the firewood, to pull the blankets inside, to tie down the shed roof. Lottie chased the crows away, giggling even as rain began to spit down from the sky. They reached shelter just as the heavens opened. Thunder cracked, rain pounded the stones, but inside the fire blazed warm. Sarah sat beside Abram, hair damp, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Lottie curled beneath quilts in the corner, already half asleep, her face peaceful. Abram looked at the window, Water streaked down the glass. The storm howled beyond. He turned to Sarah. "You ever think we'd end up here?" She shook her head. "I didn't think I'd end up anywhere." "Why'd you keep going after he died, after the town turned, after the whipping? Why didn't you just lie down and quit?" Her voice was steady. "Because she needed me to stand, and because somewhere in the smallest part of me, I believed someone good would still find us." He looked at her. "Did they?" She smiled. "I think so." That night the storm passed. The clouds broke. And in the clear, dark sky above the fort, the stars returned, brighter than before, almost like they were celebrating, almost like the heavens themselves had been holding their breath, waiting for a mother and child to be seen, heard, held. Lottie snored softly in her sleep. Sarah leaned her head on Abram's shoulder. He didn't move. He just sat there, heart full, rifle leaning quiet in the corner. The war was over. And they had won. Not with bullets, not with vengeance, but with truth, with grit, with love that did not falter. But in the end, it was never just about justice. It was about dignity. It was about a mother who refused to disappear, a child who kept hope alive when the world tried to bury it, and a man who returned from silence to speak for them both. They weren't survivors anymore. They were a family.